Jamal Carter, a math genius from Houston, had spent his whole life proving people wrong. But today, the stakes were higher. The racist professors at Southern Texas University had plotted against him, hoping to humiliate him in front of everyone. But what they didn't know, they had just challenged the wrong student. As Jamal picked up the chalk, the room grew tense. Whispers filled the air. Cameras came out. Everyone expected him to crumble. Instead, what happened next left them speechless. By the time he was done, their entire plan had backfired in the most unbelievable way. Do you stand with justice? Then hit that like button, subscribe, and let's keep these powerful stories alive. Jamal Carter stepped onto the Southern Texas University campus with a deep breath, his heart pounding in a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. This was it, the moment he had been dreaming of since he was a kid. STU had one of the most rigorous mathematics programs in the country, and he worked tirelessly to earn his place among its students. For as long as he could remember, numbers had been his world. While other kids spent their afternoons on video games or playing basketball at the park, Jamal was solving complex equations and challenging himself with calculus problems far beyond his grade level. His teachers had called him a prodigy. But growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood in Houston, few people understood his obsession with numbers. He had often been called a nerd, an outlier, even an oddity. But here, in the world of higher mathematics, he thought he had finally found his place. Yet, as he walked through the tree-lined paths leading toward the mathematics department, he could feel something was off. The subtle shift in conversations when he passed by, the quick, assessing glances, the way students eyed him with mild curiosity or, in some cases, thinly veiled skepticism. He was one of the few black students in the entire math department, and people noticed. Jamal adjusted the strap of his backpack, ignoring the looks. He wasn't here to make friends or worry about what others thought. He was here to learn, to prove that he belonged in one of the top math programs in the country. No one was going to take that from him. That confidence carried him through the day until he met Professor Hargrove. Dr. Theodore Hargrove had been a professor at STU for nearly 30 years, known for his brutal exams, intimidating lectures, and unwavering belief that mathematics was not for faint of heart. He prided himself on pushing students past their limits, but some whispered that his harshest scrutiny always seemed to fall on students like Jamal, students who didn't fit his unspoken mold of what a mathematician should be. Jamal walked into Hargrove's classroom, a large lecture hall with tiered seating that overlooked the professor's podium. The room was already buzzing with quiet conversations as students settled in. He found a seat near the middle, pulling out his notebook and a freshly sharpened pencil. The moment Hargrove walked in, the room fell silent. He was a tall, thin man with sharp, hawk-like features and piercing blue eyes that scanned the students like he was assessing their worth. He wore an old-fashioned tweed jacket, complete with elbow patches, and carried a stack of neatly arranged papers. He cleared his throat, then looked directly at Jamal. "Ah, you must be Carter." Jamal straightened slightly. "Yes, sir." Hargrove's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, let's see if you can keep up." A few students chuckled under their breath. Jamal felt his stomach tighten, but he forced himself to remain composed. This wasn't new. He had dealt with doubters his entire life. He would prove himself the way he always had, with numbers. The first lecture was intense. Hargrove wasted no time diving into complex theorems and abstract algebraic concepts, writing equations furiously on the chalkboard as he spoke. Jamal took meticulous notes, his mind absorbing everything at a rapid pace. But he could feel the professor's eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to stumble. As the class ended, students gathered their things, and Jamal was about to leave when he heard Hargrove's voice again. "Carter, stay for a moment." A few students glanced back as they exited, but Jamal squared his shoulders and approached the professor's desk. Hargrove leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "What's your background?" Jamal frowned slightly. "Excuse me? Where did you study? What's your mathematical foundation?" Jamal took a slow breath. "I attended a magnet high school in Houston. Took AP Calculus BC in my sophomore year. Self-studied number theory and linear algebra. I placed in the top 5 in the state math competition last year." Hargrove raised an eyebrow. Impressive, but the way he said it didn't feel like a compliment, more like a challenge. We'll see if that translates here. My class is not for those who need hand-holding. I don't need hand-holding, Jamal said firmly. Hargrove studied him for a long moment before giving a dismissive nod. Good. Then prove it. Jamal walked out of the lecture hall, his mind buzzing. He knew what had just happened. Hargrove had singled him out, and if he wasn't careful, the professor would do everything in his power to push him out. But Jamal had no intention of letting that happen. Jamal quickly became the best student in his classes. He solved problems faster than anyone, and his answers were always correct. His reputation spread across campus, and even upperclassmen started hearing about the freshman math genius. Students would gather around him after class, hoping to understand complex equations in ways that their professors couldn't explain. At first, Jamal thought his talent would earn him favor with his instructors. Most of them were encouraging, praising his work, and challenging him with advanced problems. But there was one professor who reacted differently, Professor Hargrove. Jamal had sensed something off about Hargrove from the very first day of class. The professor rarely made eye contact with him, even when answering his questions. He spoke in a monotone voice whenever Jamal participated, as if his presence were an inconvenience. While other students were met with nods of approval, Jamal received curt, dismissive responses. He tried to ignore it. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe Hargrove was just tough on all students. But as the weeks passed, the hostility became impossible to overlook. One day, during a lecture on differential equations, Jamal answered a question before Hargrove had even finished writing it on the board. Since you seem to know everything, why don't you solve this? Hargrove said, his tone sharp. Jamal felt a few students turn their heads toward him. Some were smirking, sensing that their professor was trying to put him on the spot. Others looked worried. They had seen how Hargrove reacted when students failed to meet his expectations. Jamal, unbothered, stood up, walked to the front of class, and took the chalk. He glanced at the equation for a moment before writing down the solution in less than a minute. The room fell silent. Hargrove's face turned red. He cleared his throat and forced a tight-lipped smile. Very well, he muttered, quickly erasing the equation as if trying to erase the moment itself. That was the moment Jamal knew. This professor wanted him to fail. For the rest of the semester, Hargrove's resentment became more and more obvious. Jamal noticed little things at first. The way the professor barely acknowledged him, how his name was often skipped when he raised his hand, how his graded assignments took longer to be returned compared to his classmates. But then, the hostility escalated. One morning, Jamal sat in his usual seat near the front. He placed his notebook and pen neatly on the desk and waited for class to start. Hargrove entered the lecture hall with a stack of graded tests. The room fell quiet as he began calling out names, handing back the exams one by one. When Jamal's turn came, Hargrove hesitated. He held Jamal's test in his hand for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he walked over and placed it on Jamal's desk with unnecessary force. Jamal looked down at his paper. 72%. His heart sank. This didn't make sense. He had checked his answers thoroughly before turning it in. He knew he had scored at least a 95%. Confused, he flipped through the pages and noticed something strange. Some of his correct answers had been marked wrong. Jamal's jaw tightened. He had studied too hard and worked too carefully for this to be a mistake. He took a deep breath, then raised his hand. Professor Hargrove, I think there's been a grading error on my tests. Hargrove barely glanced at him. I doubt that, he said. Jamal's stomach twisted. I double-checked my work. If you have time after class, I'd like to go over it with you. Hargrove sighed and waved a dismissive hand. If you believe there's an issue, you can take it up with the department. But I don't make mistakes in grading. A few students exchanged glances. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could see what was happening, but no one dared to speak up. Jamal felt a flash of anger, but he swallowed it. Arguing in front of the class wouldn't help. He would take his case to the department. He wasn't going to let this slide. After class, Jamal gathered his things and headed straight to the mathematics department office. He spoke with the administrative assistant, explaining that he wanted a reevaluation of his test. "You'll need to submit a formal request," she said, handing him a form. Jamal filled it out right away and submitted it. "How long will this take?" "Usually about a week," she replied. "We'll review it and notify you of the results." Jamal nodded, thanking her before leaving. He knew that standing up for himself was necessary, but something told him that this was only the beginning of his battle with Professor Hargrove. If you're hooked on this story so far, just wait. It's about to get even crazier. But before we continue, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss powerful stories like this. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let's get back to the story. Days passed, and Jamal focused on his studies. He didn't want to dwell on the test situation, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. His suspicions were confirmed during the next lecture. As students took their seats, Hargrove stood at the front of class, a smug expression on his face. "Today, we will be doing an in-class problem set," he announced. "No notes, no books. Just you and your minds." Jamal didn't mind. He thrived under pressure. But as Hargrove handed out the papers, he noticed something strange. His packet was different from everyone else's. The problems on his sheet were far more difficult. Some of them weren't even covered in class yet. Jamal clenched his jaw. This was intentional. He looked up at Hargrove, who smirked ever so slightly before turning away. Fine, Jamal thought. If this is how he wants to play, then so be it. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Despite the unfair challenge, Jamal poured every ounce of his focus into solving the problems. The room was filled with the sound of pens scratching against paper, but Jamal was in his own world. Numbers, equations, and formulas raced through his mind as he methodically worked through each question. By the time Hargrove called for the papers, Jamal had completed every problem. He placed his sheet on the professor's desk and met his gaze, refusing to look away. Hargrove's smirk faded just a little. Jamal walked back to his seat, knowing that whatever game Hargrove was playing, he wasn't going to lose. In a dimly lit office on the third floor of the mathematics building, Professor Hargrove sat with two other professors, their expressions serious, their voices hushed. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the campus, but inside, the air was thick with tension. "We have to do something about that Carter kid," one of them muttered, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden desk. "He doesn't belong here," another added, shaking his head in disapproval. Hargrove smirked, leaning back in his chair with a slow, deliberate motion. "I have an idea. Let's set up a special competition. We'll make sure he loses." The other two professors exchanged glances before breaking into quiet chuckles. It was a foolproof plan. They would disguise their prejudice as academic rigor, ensuring that Jamal Carter would be humiliated in front of his peers. The announcement of the competition spread quickly across campus, creating a buzz among students and faculty alike. Flyers were posted on bulletin boards. Emails were sent out, and whispers filled the lecture halls. A special mathematics challenge, open to all students, promising prestige and a letter of recommendation from the department head himself. But there was an unspoken understanding. This competition wasn't for just anyone. It was for Jamal, a carefully orchestrated trap. Jamal, however, was unfazed. He had spent years honing his mathematical abilities, solving complex equations for fun while others played video games or watched television. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were patterns, stories waiting to be unraveled. On the day of the competition, the lecture hall was packed. Students sat in clusters, murmuring among themselves. Some were excited, others nervous. The air smelled of fresh chalk and the faint aroma of coffee from those who had pulled all-nighters in preparation. Jamal entered, his dreadlocks tied back, his expression calm but focused. He took a seat near the front, his sharp eyes scanning the massive whiteboard at the front of the room. The moment the first problem appeared on the screen, the murmuring ceased. The equations were monstrous, far beyond anything expected at an undergraduate level. Integrals nested within differentials, cryptic summations, and theoretical constructs that would stump even the brightest graduate students. The other competitors hesitated, their faces paling as they struggled to comprehend the problems before them. But for Jamal, it was different. His mind moved like a well-oiled machine, dissecting each problem with precision. He saw through the complexity, recognizing the underlying structures hidden within the chaos. The first equation, a cleverly disguised variation of a problem he had solved months ago. He picked up his pen and got to work. Minutes passed, then more. Students around him fumbled with their calculations, sighing in frustration. Hargrove, sitting at the judge's table, watched Jamal closely, expecting him to falter. But instead, the young man's confidence grew. One problem solved, then another, then another. His pen moved fluidly, his calculations flawless. Gasps rippled through the hall as students began to notice what was happening. Jamal was not just competing. He was dominating. Hargrove's jaw tightened. This was not how it was supposed to go. Just as Jamal completed the final problem, Hargrove slammed his hand on the table, making the room jolt to silence. This is impossible. You must have cheated. A collective hush fell over the room. Jamal, still gripping his pen, turned slowly toward Hargrove. His chest tightened. He had faced discrimination before, but this was blatant. "I didn't cheat," he said, his voice steady. "I just know math." Hargrove scoffed. "Then prove it, in front of everyone. Right now." Jamal's jaw clenched. He could see the smug satisfaction in Hargrove's eyes, the professor's belief that he had successfully backed him into a corner. But Jamal wasn't going to let them win. He straightened his posture and met Hargrove's gaze with unyielding confidence. "Fine. Give me another problem." Hargrove exchanged glances with his colleagues before turning back to Jamal. "You want another problem?" He smirked. "Let's see if you can handle this." He strode up to the board and picked up a piece of chalk. With deliberate strokes, he wrote an equation so convoluted that even professors in the room would have struggled to solve it. The room was silent, all eyes on Jamal. Jamal walked up to the board, gripping the chalk firmly. He scanned the equation, taking it all in. The air was thick with anticipation. Then he began to write. His movements were swift but precise, each step flowing naturally into the next. The audience watched in stunned silence as he deconstructed the problem, breaking it down into smaller, manageable parts. Within minutes, he had reached the final answer. Jamal turned around, placing the chalk down gently. "That's the solution. Check it." Hargrove's face darkened as he hurriedly verified the answer. His fingers twitched, his breath came in short, uneven bursts. When he finished, his lips pressed into a thin line. It was correct, flawlessly so. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some students exchanged astonished glances. Others smirked, enjoying Professor's obvious defeat. One voice, bold and clear, broke through the murmurs. "Looks like you owe him an apology." Hargrove's hands curled into fists. He had been outplayed, publicly humiliated by a student he had deemed unworthy. But he wasn't done. No, this wasn't over. Jamal could see it in his eyes, the hidden agenda, the lingering resentment. This wasn't just about the competition anymore. This was war. Hargrove was speechless. His face turned a shade of red that was impossible to ignore. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as his colleagues exchanged knowing glances. The air in the room was thick with tension, a silence so profound that it seemed to press against the walls. Professor Daniels, one of the senior faculty members, cleared his throat. "Dr. Hargrove, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Hargrove opened his mouth, then closed it again. His mind raced for an excuse, a justification, anything that could salvage his reputation. But there was none. The evidence was clear, undeniable. Jamal had proven himself in front of everyone. "He's incredible," one of the professors finally murmured, breaking the silence. Another nodded. "We were so blinded by our biases that we failed to see the genius in front of us." The students who had gathered to watch the showdown began to murmur amongst themselves. Some whispered apologies to Jamal, while others simply stared in awe. The once isolated young man had now become the most talked-about student on campus. Word of Jamal's triumph spread like wildfire. Students who had once doubted him were now eager to study with him. Those who had dismissed his abilities found themselves questioning their own prejudices. Professors who had remained silent in the face of discrimination now scrambled to align themselves with Jamal's success. "Hey, man, I was wrong about you," a student named Eric admitted, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I just listened to what people were saying, but you're the real deal." Jamal studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thanks, but you shouldn't have to wait until someone proves themselves to treat them with respect." Eric looked down, ashamed. "You're right." Even some of the professors who had been skeptical of Jamal's abilities began to sing his praises. They spoke of his mathematical prowess in lectures and encouraged students to read his papers. The transformation was almost comical. The same people who had dismissed him were now holding him up as an example. But Jamal wasn't interested in their approval. He had bigger things on his mind. One evening, as Jamal was studying in the library, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. An email from an unknown sender. Subject: "Your story needs to be told." Curious, he clicked on it. "Hello, Jamal. My name is Lisa Reynolds, and I'm a journalist with the National Daily. I've been following your story, and I believe the world needs to hear about what happened. Would you be open to an interview?" Jamal's hands tightened around his phone. The thought of going public with his experience was daunting. It wasn't just about him. It was about every black student who had ever been doubted, every person who had been held back by prejudice. He took a deep breath and typed his response. "I'm in." The interview took place the next day. Lisa was thorough, asking about everything from Jamal's upbringing to his passion for math to the discrimination he had faced. Jamal spoke honestly, not holding back. "I knew from the start that some professors didn't want me here," he admitted. "But I also knew that I belonged. I wasn't going to let their hate define me." Lisa nodded, her pen scratching against her notepad. "And what do you hope to achieve by sharing your story?" Jamal met her gaze. "I want change. I want students who come after me to walk into these classrooms knowing they have every right to be here." The article, titled "Math Prodigy Outsmarts Racist Professors," went viral. Social media exploded with discussions about Jamal's story. Some condemned the university's handling of the situation, demanding accountability. Others celebrated Jamal's victory, calling him an inspiration. The university had no choice but to respond. The administration launched an internal investigation into Hargrove and his colleagues. The more they dug, the worse it got. Email exchanges revealed coordinated efforts to undermine Jamal's progress. Old complaints from other students surfaced, painting a clear picture of systemic discrimination. Hargrove and his allies scrambled to cover their tracks, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. They had nowhere to hide. During a tense faculty meeting, the university president addressed the issue head-on. "This institution stands for academic excellence and inclusivity," he declared. "There is no place for discrimination here." Effective immediately, Dr. Hargrove is suspended pending further review. The room erupted into murmurs. Some were shocked. Others, not so much. Hargrove, his face pale, tried to protest. "This is a witch hunt. This is political correctness gone too far." The president cut him off. "No, Dr. Hargrove, this is accountability." The final verdict came weeks later. Hargrove was forced to resign in disgrace. His reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins. He had spent years wielding power over students, and now that power was gone. Jamal, on the other hand, was thriving. Companies that had once ignored him were now flooding his inbox with job offers. Research institutions reached out, eager to collaborate with him. He had gone from being an outcast to being one of the most sought-after young minds in mathematics. On graduation day, he stood on stage in his cap and gown, looking out at the crowd. His parents sat in the front row, pride shining in their eyes. His classmates, once skeptical, now cheered for him. When it was time for his speech, he stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and spoke from the heart. "I was told I didn't belong here, that no matter how hard I worked, it would never be enough. But I'm standing here today because I refuse to let anyone tell me who I was." Talent speaks louder than hate. The audience erupted in applause. Some stood, clapping and cheering. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Jamal had done it, not just for himself, but for every student who had ever been told they weren't good enough. This is why stories like Jamal's need to be told. Injustice thrives in silence, but the truth has power. If you believe in justice, if you want to hear more stories like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. Let's make sure the world never forgets